Hey, it's Jared. In this video, we're going to take a look at my over now 1 year of time with the Sony a7cR and talk about how it stood up. And I'll talk about some of the other cameras that I shoot with as well. But predominantly, we're going to be talking about this camera because it's a great compact camera that shoots high resolution images. This is my year experience, as well as just sharing some of the observations and things that I've grown to love about this camera. So first, let's just talk about the design and build of this camera. One of the reasons that I went with it is because it is very compact. It's a small camera body. Now, at the time that I bought this camera, I had been shooting with the Leica Q3, and I did at the time also do a comparison of this camera and the Leica Q3. I've since then had time to spend with the Leica Q3 4.3 as well, and I constantly find myself coming back to the Sony a7cR because it's a great camera and it allows me to switch out lenses. Though the Leicas are fantastic at what they do, and I absolutely love those cameras, being able to switch out a lens for the different scenarios that I find myself in is just a must, because that's what I'm used to. So with the A7R, the design is great because it's small and compact, even though you can put very large lenses, and one would say even with this 35mm G Master lens on here, that it's not so much of a compact camera anymore, but there are lots of compact lens options that you can use with a camera such as this. This is a 60 megapixel capture, and so that's a big image, and that's one of the main reasons that I wanted this camera. When I go out and shoot, I typically am going to shoot with this camera more for fun or maybe for smaller projects, and I don't necessarily need the fastest and the best option that's out there. I have the Sony A1, and I use that when I need a camera that's fast, when I need a camera that does it all. Now, this camera does it all as well, but it's just not quite as fast as, say, the Sony A1. It's not quite as fast as, say, the Sony a7C II either, but it shoots much higher resolution images, and it has some features that I just absolutely can't live without these days. So the compact nature of this camera is one of the things that keeps me traveling with it all the time. It lives in my laptop bag, and when I'm not carrying my laptop bag, I'm often carrying a smaller bag with this camera in it because it's small and fits, and I could bring this lens and perhaps another lens. I've definitely been shooting a lot with the G Master, the 85mm G Master 2, because this is a more recent, probably the most recent lens from Sony that I have purchased. And so I've been spending a lot more time switching between those different lenses on the Sony a7cR. So let's talk performance and features. This camera obviously shoots a very large image. That's one of the reasons that people would buy it. You can either get this camera or you could get the Sony a7R5, which shoots a 60 megapixel image, this being the compact, I'd say maybe little brother of that camera. And I've had time to spend with the A7R, and I love that camera, but as far as a larger body camera, I prefer to shoot with my A1. The A1 will shoot 50 megapixel, it'll shoot a lot faster continuous than this camera, and the autofocus is, I'd say, a little bit faster as well. But the performance of the A7cR is no slouch. It just, in those faster paced scenarios, I find it not to be quite fast enough for me. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And when we look at images, I'll talk about some of the things that I go through, emotions and different things as part of the experience of shooting with that camera in all sorts of different environments. So don't skip, make sure to watch through to that part. But one of the downsides of that 60 megapixel image is that this camera is not as good in low light situations as a camera that is lower resolution from Sony, of course. It does an amazing job in low light compared to maybe what I was used to several years ago, but in comparison to what the A7C II, the Sony A1, and cameras like that can do in lower light situations, I find this lacking. And so if I'm going to need to rely on the camera performance in lower light situations, which means boosting that ISO, probably not going to take the A7cR with me because there's a higher likelihood of having some noise in my image. However, I'm really only able to do that because I have several different cameras that I shoot professionally with. If this was my only camera, I wouldn't have any problem, even in lower light situations. Of course, you can compensate with a wide aperture lens. And of course, bringing in some additional lights, usually not a big deal. So let's talk autofocus. The autofocus on this camera is great. It doesn't matter what lens I'm using, it seems to capture autofocus relatively quick. And I don't find any of my other cameras being that much faster, even the A1, which is probably the autofocus king. And I'm super excited to get my hands on the A1 Mark II that is shipping anytime now. But with this camera, it autofocuses great. It doesn't even matter if I'm in lower light situations, it does a great job with autofocus. I'd say one of the areas that this camera lacks in is the speed in which you can continuously shoot. Yes, it's a higher resolution image, which means it's a much bigger image that the camera has to process, so it's not going to shoot at as fast of a continuous rate as you would get out of cameras that capture at smaller resolutions. And even the A1 is quite a bit faster at continuous shooting than the A7cR. But in the majority of the instances that I find myself shooting in, the burst capture rate is fast enough on the A7cR. One area in which I think the A7cR could improve is battery life. Now, this camera does tend to live in my bag, and so it goes long periods of time without getting charged. And I think I'm more aware of the battery life being used because I will turn this camera on, shoot 1 or 2 images, put it back in the bag. And that will take place multiple times throughout the week, maybe with one day being a heavier shooting, maybe capturing 20 or 30 images. But most of the time, I'm probably capturing a couple of images because I find myself either needing to take an image for like a YouTube thumbnail, or I'm driving and I see something really nice and I want to stop and take a picture of a scene or a landscape or something like that. This is the camera that I want to have with me in those different scenarios. So I find myself kind of wishing that this camera had a little bit better battery life. I'm not saying that it's bad, and it's bad in comparison to the other cameras, but I do notice it because chances are when I turn this camera on, the battery life is probably going to be low. It's at 28% right now, and I feel like I just put a new battery in this last week, and I probably only shot like 50 or so images. And I'm also aware of the fact that this camera is connected to my phone, so when I power the camera on, it's getting GPS coordinates for the images from my phone, and that's going to use a little bit of battery as well. And perhaps there's even a persistent connection there when the camera is powered off. I've definitely experienced that with other cameras. I haven't really looked into it too much on this one. I'm not saying that the battery life is bad. It just seems like the battery always ends up being low, so I always have an extra battery, and I definitely know that I could top it off at any time by plugging into the USB-C and just charging the battery directly through the camera. So before I go any further, let's take a look at some images that I have shot with this camera. Now, what I love about Lightroom is easily being able to separate images out by camera. So we're looking at all of the images that I have shot with this particular camera. We'll bring over the details of those images here. There are some side-by-side images here. You can see some doubles. I've done some camera comparisons. I've done some lens comparisons as well. And so we'll just skip through some of those. What I find myself often doing is shooting things like a social media image or a YouTube thumbnail. You can see this image was shot with the 35mm at 1/160th, f2.8, and 1000 ISO. And it's a relatively clean image. You can see there's a little bit of noise down in here, but some of that is added in a couple of different ways. First of all, on this particular lens, I am using the Short Stash Everyday filter, and so that adds a black mist diffusion to it and a polarizer as well. Absolutely love it. It gives my images a really nice look, and I love using that filter. But it does tend to add a little bit of noise to the image, and with that at ISO 1000 plus a little bit of processing to my image, that can affect the image overall as well. Not a bad image, very clean looking. Now, if we scroll up and look at some sports, this is where I tend to have a little bit of an issue with the camera because it's just not super fast. When you're shooting basketball or soccer, fast moving sports, you want a camera that shoots really fast continuously. And this camera is not the fastest continuously. So there's many times when I will miss an opportunity for a shot. Here's my son getting ready to shoot a free throw. You know, this image is nice and sharp. It's still downloading the full resolution image from the cloud, but overall just a really good image. And if I punch in, I mean, you could see how far I punch in. I could crop this image right here and it would still be a pretty decent image. There are a little bit of issues with it. I was using the CRI 85mm, has a little bit of an issue around edges with adding some color. Those are things that can be fixed in post. That's not a camera issue, that's a lens situation there. So with these images, I'm trying to capture moments that are happening fast, and it can be a bit challenging because things are happening really quickly. Sometimes, you wish that you had gotten an image maybe a few frames back, but this camera just isn't fast enough. And so you get what you get. And I guess, with this camera, you're getting a 60 megapixel image, so you can't complain too much. But in a situation where you're shooting fast moving stuff, you have to decide, do I want the large resolution image, or do I want a faster capture rate or faster burst rate? And that means going with a lower resolution image, perhaps shooting with the A7C2 or an A1 or an A7 Mark IV, something like that shoots a bit faster. But some really good images. I mean, these are just super clean, very good looking images. If I get the right moment, which, like I said, in fast moving sports can be challenging because things are moving so quickly, when I get the perfect moment, the images are looking great. Now here's some thumbnails that I shot. As you can see, again, I was shooting a couple of things. I had that filter on, forgot to take it off. It was giving kind of a colorization effect, the polarizer effect when you take a picture of a screen. Then taking some other pictures of some laptops. We've got some images that I took at church that are pretty good. Got some more thumbnails here for that 85mm G Master lens that I was just talking about at the beginning of the video. And so that's what I end up using this camera a lot for, is all of the random shots that I might be taking, whether it's at one of my kids' sports or for some images for a blog post or YouTube thumbnails. Very common that I am shooting in those different types of environments. And sometimes I'm just messing around. Like I was just trying out a different filter. I had a big time diffusion filter on this one. You could see how soft that image was because of the filter that I had on it. And then as we scroll up, I was in Glacier National Park taking pictures with this camera and comparing it against the Leica Q343. A lot of these images I was either shooting with an 85mm. You can see this was right after I got the 85mm G Master Mark II. I think a few of them I also threw on a wider lens as well. Here's a image that I took of the new Peak Design outdoor line backpack. Fantastic backpack. Absolutely love using it. And it just looks so cool in that shot, right in the outdoors, which is what it was designed to be used in. And of course, took some pictures of those Leica cameras with this camera, because like I said, I use it quite often for thumbnails, and I never go wrong with this camera. It lands fantastic images every single time. Even if I'm shooting a thumbnail of myself with the camera on a little tripod and remotely triggering it. In my other hand was my phone, and I was triggering the camera remotely using the Sony Creator app and had the focal point right here. And this obviously is for a smart ring review on my other YouTube channel. And so, just a great camera for capturing all of those moments. And then, just getting some images of my family, which this is the camera that I have on me most of the time. So it's great for capturing all those moments. We had some sunflowers that were bursting out in our front yard. A lot more thumbnails. Went and tested out a new autonomous drone and took that camera with me. We've got some images. I think I was doing some real estate photography here of some land that's available for sale. And then we were out at a campground. And I mean, so this camera just goes with me everywhere. I shot a wedding earlier this year and had the camera with me. It was my second camera. And so I got a ton of just great images with this camera in a situation like this, where I was kind of, capturing movement, wishing that I had a little bit faster of a camera. But I mean, just amazing images that I was getting. It captures such good images. You could see I captured a lot of that wedding using that camera. Even though I had my A1 with me, I was using the A1 quite a bit as well. Took some pictures of our travel trailer that I listed for sale on Facebook Marketplace. Another wedding. I mean, just lots of images. This one's still downloading a little bit, but I mean, the amount that you can zoom in on this, I mean, just because you have so much resolution to work with, it's absolutely fantastic. I also took some team photos for baseball, some soccer photos earlier in the year, had the 100 to 400 millimeter G Master and captured an image of this plane flying overhead. And so there's just so much that you can do with this camera because it's so versatile. I mean, not only is it absolutely fantastic for shooting photos, but it does shoot 4K video as well. Even earlier in the year, shooting images at my son's baseball team. Great images, lots of dynamic aspects to this. I mean, freezes the action, great color. I mean, this camera just does a great job, and you can see just how many different things I've shot with it over the year. And then now I'm getting back to last year and some of the images that I shot when I first got this camera, a little bit of real estate. Yeah, this image was taken on December 1st of last year, which is just over a year ago. And I mean, these images are great looking. Of course, they've got to download the full resolution version from the cloud. But I mean, so much detail in this shot as we look around and just get in nice and close. So much detail and amazing color in the wood here. And that's one of the reasons why I keep shooting with this camera, because I can change out the lenses, and I find myself in these different scenarios where if I had a camera that had a fixed focal length, just a fixed lens, and I couldn't switch it out, I would have to move around quite a bit. It wouldn't be as versatile, and I find myself needing versatility over anything else. I find myself also wanting high resolution images so that I can do a lot of cropping. So you could see just in Lightroom here, I have over 1,200 images that I've taken this last year with this camera, which isn't really a whole lot, but you can see every single image that I have here in Lightroom is an image that I am using for something. They're sports photos of my kids' team. There's some test photos. There are YouTube thumbnails and all that good stuff. And so while I have 1,251 images in Lightroom, I've probably taken at least double that. And there are, of course, images that I delete. When I'm shooting sports, I might shoot 200 or 300 images and maybe import about 20 or 30 of them. And so I've used this camera quite a bit over the last year and have come to love it because of its versatility. So let's talk about the pros and cons of this camera. Well, some of the pros obviously are its compact size. I can make it pretty small if I put a smaller lens on here. Or of course, if I need it, I could put a nice telephoto. I could put a 70 to 200. I have the 100 to 400 millimeter, which does look pretty comical on this camera, but it's very capable. And I can capture 60 megapixel images without adding a whole lot of weight to that package. The camera produces amazing images with a lot of clarity and dynamic range. And the advanced autofocus system that comes in this camera has never left me missing shots. So let's talk about the cons. Well, one of the cons might be that there's a single card slot, which to some people is a complete no-go. And some professionals might say, I would never shoot with a camera that only has one card slot. However, I've been shooting with Sony cameras for a long time now, probably getting close to 13 or 14 years, if not maybe even 15. I haven't done the math lately, but I have never had a card failure in the camera. If anything, I've had a card failure after I put it in my computer. And so if you're very vigilant in your backup process and how you take care of your SD cards, you're not going to have a problem. Yes, I would rather have dual card slot, but I understand that I'm sacrificing some features for the size of the camera body. Now, another con would be using this camera when I know that I can use one of my bigger cameras that has more buttons. This doesn't have a joystick on it. And so when I am trying to move the focus point around, I have to hit the center button and move it around. And then I have to hit the center button again so that I can get over to the ISO and adjust the ISO. So there's a little bit more finagling with buttons, whereas the joystick that comes on the bigger cameras is just a game changer. It's so much easier to be able to move my focus point around. And I'm always using a smaller focus point so that I can make sure that the camera is locked on the subject. Only when things are moving fast do I do tap to focus, or do I allow it to follow the subject and use its intelligent features. And that's why I hardly ever miss anything, because I'm typically telling the camera an area, a smaller area that I want it to maintain focus on. And then it's up to the camera to decide what's the subject in that smaller area. So it's not looking all over the screen. It's not doing as much work when you're using the small focus area. But that just makes me rely more on tapping on the subject on the screen and letting the camera follow the subject around, which essentially does the same thing that I would do with the joystick anyways. Now, some people will complain about rolling shutter on this camera when shooting video. I don't shoot a whole lot of video on this camera, and if I do, the camera is probably on a tripod and I'm shooting like Instagram reel content or something like that. I don't shoot a whole lot of video with this camera, so rolling shutter typically isn't an issue for me. So let's talk about use cases and who this camera is best for. Well, I think when you talk about larger resolution images, you're probably thinking of landscape photography or maybe even portrait photography. There are a couple instances where having the most resolution possible is a good thing. And with landscapes, that's a really good thing because that means you could take a big image and crop in quite a bit if you need to, and you'll still have a relatively high resolution image. That is definitely why I wanted a 60 megapixel, because I live in Montana and I find myself shooting different things that I didn't expect to shoot all the time. And so having that higher resolution, being able to crop in later because maybe I couldn't get close enough to something because I either had a prime lens or there's a fence or something and I don't want to trespass. And so I shoot something and then crop in later. I have that ability with this camera. And so an A7cR is a fantastic camera when you want a compact camera and you want that high resolution. And I definitely recommend it to photographers that want a camera that is more compact. Now, with a camera like this, there are a lot of lens options. There's the Sony G line of lenses that are smaller lenses, and I find those to be absolutely fantastic to pair with this if you want to keep the camera really compact. However, because I have some G Master lenses, I find myself constantly returning to the G Master lenses because they have a much faster aperture, like an f1.4, even an f1.8. Those other lenses are usually a bit slower, but yeah, they're smaller. And so there's trade-offs. There's trade-offs with the smaller camera body. There's trade-offs with smaller lenses. But my favorite G Master lens to shoot with on this camera is the 35mm. Absolutely love this lens. And when I want a more compact lens, I'll probably be shooting with the 24mm f2.8G lens, which is significantly smaller than this lens and makes for a very powerful, compact camera system. So to sum all of it up, my experience over probably the last 14 or 15 months with this camera is that it is irreplaceable in the scheme of things for me. I absolutely love this camera because the high resolution allows me to get images when I don't necessarily know how I want to crop them. I know that I could pull back and get more area in case I need that in my image, knowing that I could crop in significantly if I need to. I know that I can rely on it because it's one of several Sony mirrorless cameras that I've had, and I've had a slew of them over the years, and none of them have failed me at all. And it's a Sony full frame with E-mount, which means it's compatible with all of the other lenses that I have for my other Sony cameras. The camera itself has definitely met all of my expectations and not left me wanting in any situations, other than of course wanting it to be faster at continuous shooting. So if you've been considering a camera like this, I've got links down in the description below to the camera, some of the accessories that I use on the camera, as well as my favorite lenses. So make sure to check out those links because it helps support the channel when you do. One big ask I have of you is to hit that subscribe button because it's really going to help me and the channel out. If you want updates from me, also check out my newsletter down in the description. But that's going to do it for my experience with over 1 year of using the A7cR. A fantastic camera. Share your thoughts and comments down below. We'll see you in the next one.